Coming up on this week's episode of TechSNAP, meet BOOTTRASH, the malware that executes before your OS does, the hard questions you need to ask your security appliance vendor before you buy one, and Project Zero finds a flaw in Fireeye's hardware appliances. Plus some great questions from our audience, a big roundup, and much, much more on this week's episode of TechSNAP. Hi, everyone, and welcome to TechSNAP. This is episode 245 of Jupiter Broadcasting's weekly Systems Network and Administration podcast. We stream this episode live on December 17th, 2015. This episode is brought to you by our two fine sponsors, DigitalOcean, two fine sponsors, three fine sponsors, and IX Systems. We'll tell you more about those great sponsors as this here show goes on. Our live stream, that's powered by the incredible Scale Engine over at scaleengine.com. That's how we power our live streams and all of our file distribution. You should go check that out. My name is Chris, and joining us every single week is our host, the admin, the teacher, and the tech, Mr. Alan Jude. Hey there, Alan.
Hey, Chris, everybody. Thanks for watching.
Alan, happy holidays to you, and with a little holiday cheer, you should show off the shirt again. This has almost become a bit now, but this is a great shirt. This is a really good one. It says, for those listening, life's too short for, there's an emoji there, software. It's the poo emoji. For the poo emoji software. That's the best use of the emoji ever, and it just happened here on the TechSNAP program. Who saw that coming? Alan?
I don't know, all the people that saw it last time I wore the shirt, but yeah.
Oh, did I? Oh, well, this is the first time I've ever seen it. I think the reason is because you're up a little higher in the frame now, so I could read it.
I'm sure we showed it off last time, but
I love it. I love the use of the emoji on Alan Jude's chest. That's a great place for it, especially that particular one. All right, well, we have actually a pretty big show today. A lot of news to get into, stuff that we've been wanting to cover now for a little bit. This first story comes from researchers at Fireeye who've spotted something pretty interesting. What do we have, Mr. Jude?
So researchers at Fireeye have spotted a new advanced persistent threat group that they've decided to call FIN1 instead of, I think they're at APT 28 so far in their regular tracking. But these guys are very specifically a financial threat group, or at least that's what Fireeye has decided to call them, and start their numbering over again for those. But they're targeting payment card data with a sophisticated new malware that Fireeye has dubbed BOOTTRASH, but I've seen other research into it call it Nemesis. But basically, what makes it unique is it executes before your operating system actually boots. So we've heard of rootkits, where it's malware that gets like into the kernel as a driver or something, and can basically make the kernel not realize that it's there. So like when you look at your list of processes that are running or try to find the files, they're just not there because code in the malware in the kernel is making them just not show up. But this one is what's called a bootkit because it's actually loading before your operating system and interacting with your operating system that way. So this malware only works against machines where the disk is MBR formatted, where it has a master boot record.
Still fairly common.
Which is still fairly common, especially in XP and before, but is turning out of favor now because of the limitations, the biggest one being that partition can't be bigger than 2 terabytes. And now that people have disks bigger than 2 terabytes, they've moved on. The other problem with MBR is you can only have 4 partitions, although one of those some of those partitions could be extended partitions, which basically just contained a table to let you have 4 partitions inside that one partition.
Oh, yeah. I'm familiar with that one.
And all kinds of ridiculousness. Crazy hacks we did to be able to get across that limitation. Whereas now we've replaced it with GPT, or the grid partition table. And this one allows you to have like 128 partitions. So, and, supports up to like 16 exabytes or something like that. Which is much more common now. And, Windows 7 or Vista maybe? I forget. Vista or 7 and forward support it. And I think there's a way to support it in Windows XP, but you couldn't boot off of it in Windows XP. But they did eventually add support so that you could have like a 3 terabyte external hard drive.
Yeah, yep.
Well, because I remember a student having bought like a new 3 terabyte hard drive or something, and was trying to copy images to it, but then it was GPT partitioned, and the version of XP we had at the college was frozen at an older version and didn't have the patch or whatever. And
yeah, my recollection would be coming up with like an external USB drive is what you're talking about.
Yeah. And it basically came GPT formatted, I think.
Yeah.
Or maybe it came MBR for compatibility and we switched it to GPT. So either way, she had to copy it. She wanted to copy a lot of files.
Yeah.
and we had to first get all the data off of it so we could reformat it with the opposite partition type that it had, and put it on that way. Anyway,
Boot trash.
so if this boot trash malware detects GPT, it just exits and does nothing.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So, how the hell is it booting and loading before the operating system? Is it in the bootloader? Is it in the MBR's bootloader section? And what's executing it? Is it a firmware thing?
Right. So the MBR, the master boot record that has your partition table, only has 512 bytes for boot code. So it doesn't live there. It actually lives in the next part. So the way booting works is your BIOS loads up and it reads that 512 bytes of code in the MBR, which mostly now just copies code from somewhere else and then runs that, because 512 bytes of code is not very much. So then there's what's called the volume boot record. So this is a chunk of space at the beginning of each of the partitions defined in the MBR. And this is basically how dual booting works, is you could have different boot code for each of those partitions so that you can just pick one and boot from it.
Okay.
So it backs up what was originally in that VBR, the volume boot record, to a different location on the disk, and then overwrites it with its boot code. So it finds some free space, usually between the partitions or at the end of the disk. Usually there's a little bit of space left over where, the number of cylinders or sectors didn't round out to a nice number. So there's 104 kilobytes of free space at the end of the disk or something. It finds that space and writes into it raw a virtual file system. And that's where it keeps the malware, the actual drivers and so on.
Nice.
And so they don't show up in any file system scan because you don't normally go and try to read that 104 kilobytes of empty space that, on a fresh hard drive should always be 0 and never be touched.
Yeah.
And then additional files and resources that won't fit there end up getting encoded as blobs and then hidden in the registry. So they pick a registry hive that looks, harmless, and actually encode a bunch of files into it. And if they ever need those files to run, they just pull them out of there, decode them, and run them. And they never actually exist on your hard drive. So, a virus scan of the disk is never going to find these.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
The virus scanner is always going to be limited to what is in the purview of the operating system.
Right, and because it's accessing the file system through the kernel, a rootkit or a bootkit can hide those files, even if they were actually there, because, the virus scanner does the system call to say, hey, let me see what's in this directory.
Just like all the other applications on the system do.
Right, and code running in the kernel could be like, I've decided I won't want you to see this file, so I'm going to just not tell you it exists.
Right.
Right. So how your system actually boots up in this case. During a normal boot, the BIOS loads the MBR loads the VBR, which then contains a bit of code that will actually start the operating system. However, during the hijacked boot process with this virus, the regular MBR will now load boot trash from the VBR space, because basically we read the VBR, moved it somewhere else, and wrote the virus into the VBR. So the MBR code loads the virus code and runs it. Now that code, the Nemesis bootkit, goes into that custom file system it found at the end of the blank space at the end of the drive, or just between two partitions or whatever. Right. And loads up a bunch of its code out of there. Then it passes control to the original boot sector. So the real VBR that it's moved somewhere else, after it loads the virus and stuff into memory, it loads up the original VBR,
right,
and runs that.
So your expected OS starts booting none the wiser.
Yeah. So then your regular OS ends up starting.
Right.
The bootkit intercepts several system interrupts to assist with the injection of the primary Nemesis components from that virtual file system into the OS. So the bootkit hijacks the BIOS interrupt responsible for miscellaneous system services and patches that associate with the interrupt vector table, which is the part at the very beginning of memory. And basically it intercepts memory queries once the operating system gains control of the computer. The bootkit then passes control to the original VBR to let it continue. While the operating system is being loaded, the bootkit is also intercepting and scanning the operating system loader memory for specific instructions that transfer the CPU from real mode to protected mode. This allows the bootkit to patch the interrupt descriptor table each time the CPU changes from real mode to protected mode, right? So every time you switch, the CPU is going to overwrite this table over here. And so the virus can detect that and then update its patch to that so that every time it goes to a certain code path, it'll always get intercepted and go into the virus.
Impressive.
So this allows the boot code to detect and intercept specific points of the operating system loader execution and inject the Nemesis components from that hidden file system in as part of the kernel. So now you've loaded the Windows kernel, but you've replaced certain parts of it with the virus. So it basically dynamically replaces bits of your kernel code with its own code. And so there's no way to detect that this is happening because the only way to do anything on the computer is ask the kernel, and the kernel is going to lie because it's infected.
Yeah.
So they have a bunch of great diagrams, like the one that you're just showing there.
Yeah.
You can see the MBR goes into the bootkit, which is the virus, which then loads which reads from the virtual file system that created in that unallocated space. Then it finds the original VBR boot code, runs that, which then runs the actual operating system. And it basically patches the kernel as you load it and replaces it with bad stuff.
This was really the motivation behind doing this is got to be. I mean, is your take on it state sponsored? I mean, the level of sophistication to something like this, the dynamic patching of the kernel, the creating the virtual file system and moving the expected VBR code to that virtual file system. To me, I look at this and I think somebody with an incredible amount of research and skills had time to put this together, and it wasn't one or two people.
Exactly. There is a reason why they're calling this Fin1. It's a serious APT group that's really out there to steal the credit cards and not get caught.
Well, one of the things I heard speculated, and I have not read this whole Fireeye piece, but one of the things I heard speculated was the Mafia, which just seemed like crap to me. It seemed like...
Well, which Mafia? The Russian Mafia? Yes. They've been stealing money from everything, They were one of the groups we thought was behind the Target one too, right?
I don't know. They didn't say. I didn't
Who
know
doesn't
it was
want
Russian
money?
I guess so. You think a group? So I guess it doesn't necessarily have to be a state. You think it could be just a group, an enterprising group of individuals.
For just the purpose of infecting point of sale systems to steal credit cards, Mafia makes more sense than a government.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. If you're stealing money. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're a government, you can just print money.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways. Taxes. Yeah. Okay. So maybe it is a Mafia group. But whoever is doing it, I mean, incredible sophistication, Alan. And Fireeye, I mean, once again, another great write-up once they find something. You got to give them that, right? A lot of things about them. Any other thoughts on this story?
Not much, but it's definitely worth checking out more if you're interested in it. And it's basically a new type of virus that no one's ever seen before.
Do they go into which operating systems are vulnerable to it? Or did they keep that?
Basically anything with MBR, because it's...
Then it would just be a matter of writing to the kernel for whatever OS you want to target.
Right. So I think it's mostly targeting XP because that's what almost all point-of-sale systems are.
Right.
Even a couple that aren't, maybe they're a newer version of Windows, but probably not that likely. And, basically... They're after probably a few specific places or specific models just because they targeted MBR specifically.
Yeah. All right. Let's take a second here. I want to tell you about iX Systems. ixsystems.com/TechSnaps, where you can go to learn more and support the TechSNAP program. Just before we got started on the show, I was trying to, for like 15 minutes, I was trying to get Alan to come up with a great way for me to really nail some sort of clever storage solution. And at the end of the day, it just kept coming back to build a FreeNAS. This is the way to do it. And, iX Systems really has a great FreeNAS Mini that I think has gotten slicker and slicker as time has gone on. They have it now with those Atom server processors in there. So it's very powerful, but low power.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? Like powerful in terms of like compute, but low power in terms of consumption, which is really nice. And also keeps heat and temperature, or heat and noise down.
Yeah. So that was the one that always people complained about of, I'm just going to use some old machine I have laying around, is like, it's going to use a lot of power and going to be noisy. This solves both those problems. The other problems you have with an older machine is it's going to be slow and not going to have, encryption offload or virtualization offload. These new server class Atoms have both of those.
Isn't that something? Isn't that something? And so they start with the FreeNAS Mini, and then their solutions go all the way up to the biggest, baddest systems and solutions you have ever seen built for the enterprise. Go over to ixsystems.com/TechSNAP and find a solution designed to make open source products rock. They have an incredible staff and team that knows this stuff in and out, involved with this stuff in the open source community. They have a great sales approach, and they have a really good support staff. Go check them out at ixsystems.com/TechSNAP. I wish I knew about them, and if I was still in consulting, this would be my secret weapon when I go to a client and say, let's start buying from them. It's going to change the experience. When I first bought my first IX Systems product, I went into it a little skeptical. I'll be honest, they wanted me to contact sales a little bit earlier in the process than I wanted to. And I thought, well, okay, that doesn't seem appropriate. I'm pretty aware and savvy of what I want. I would prefer not to. But I did it just as an experiment. This is before they were a sponsor. And I didn't really have a lot of other outward experiences with them other than just at conferences. And I have to tell you what, that pre-sales meeting that we had ended up being a huge, huge thing for me because I ended up saving money. I ended up building a better product that we are still today using here at the JB1 Studios to power our back-end storage infrastructure. And if it wasn't for that pre-sales call, I would have gone and purchased something that didn't really fit my needs. And so today, I still remember going back and going, they just saved me money and got me a better product. And it's like that throughout the entire enterprise. ixsystems.com/TechSNAP. I love it. Also,
there's a reason they won an award for best at customer service.
They just got that great award. You can check it out on their blog. And there's a FreeNAS logo design contest going on.
Yes. So they're looking to refresh the logo for the FreeNAS now that it's all fancy and so on. And it's mostly, I think, because FreeNAS 10 is coming soon. But so they have a contest and they have everything you need. This is the most organized logo design contest I've seen in a while. Like if you scroll down a bit there, they have a list of things to kind of get you started and think about it. List of places where they're going to use it, so you can kind of think of what it's got to look like.
That's smart.
They want to use it right in the GUI in the web interface for the FreeNAS. They want to use it on the website. They want to be able to print it on flyers. They want to email it to people. They want to make T-shirts out of it.
Here's the color palette, also very clever. This is great.
With all the details. So the
Pantone numbers. And
they're used to working with professional designers and stuff. So they have everything you need.
You should send a link to this to Ange. Seriously, be like, hey, take a few notes from this. This is a great idea. This is really good. They are clever. They got their stuff together. And maybe you'd have a chance out there. I know we do have some designers in the audience. Also, we're looking for designers to refresh the TechSNAP look. So email Angela at jupiterbroadcasting.com if you think you might want to take a crack at these frames we use, for our show.
But yes, the FreeNAS logo contest, the winner will get $750 or a FreeNAS Mini.
Yeah. And, of course, we mentioned this because IX Systems, folks behind FreeNAS, it's really cool. So go check them out, ixsystems.com/TechSNAP. Okay, Alan, let's shift gears and go into this guide you found for, I like this, a decision maker's guide to buying security appliances and gateways.
Yes. So this one mostly spoke to me because of our interview on BSD Now yesterday.
Oh, yeah?
So if you, that's out now. So if you haven't, go download that right now. But on BSD Now, we interviewed Paul Doedek, who works at a company that makes a security appliance based on BSD. And also it fits in with our next story coming up as well.
Nice.
But anyway, so this is a decision maker's guide of what questions you should ask yourself before you go buy some random security appliance. With the prevalence of targeted, APT-style threats and the business risk of data breaches reaching the board level, and the market for security appliances is as hot as it's ever been, right? Everybody's trying to sell these things. Many organizations feel the need to beef up their security, and vendors of security appliances offer a plethora of, content inspection or email security or anti-APT appliances, all with, fancy, glossy marketing brochures full of impressive-sounding claims and so on. But how do you decide which one you actually should buy? So this article provides a bit of a guide to help you shop for an appliance, and that might actually be worth the number of zeros on the price tag.
Nice.
So their biggest point was that most security appliances are Linux-based, or open source based anyway, and use a large number of open source libraries to parse untrusted data streams that they're inspecting, right? It turns out, even though you're paying all this money for this, usually they're just using some libraries that you could have cobbled together yourself with maybe some proprietary stuff to make it slightly better. But these libraries, along with the proprietary code added by the vendor, form the attack surface for the appliance, right? That is the code that is exposed to an outside attacker looking to attack that appliance. As we'll see in our next story, basically, if this appliance is going to sit there and inspect everything coming in on your network, those all happen to also be attacks against the appliance.
Sure, that makes sense.
And so you have to be careful with that. And the other thing is that all of these security appliances require a privileged position on your network, right? In order to be able to intercept traffic and be able to block it, or even just to monitor it, they basically need to be able to see everything and possibly modify it as it goes through. And as soon as you have, that's what every attacker really wants, is the ability to spy on everything going into and out of your network.
Yeah, really.
And the ability to modify it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
They're basically, it is the holy grail of your network. So you really got to ask your question about the security of the appliance.
We've also talked about how often your monitoring device or your monitoring appliance or your Nagios server, how actually critical that is if it has firewall rules into all of these devices monitoring.
Exactly.
Kind of the same concept here. Exactly. Only in this one, it's even more.
It's literally a wiretap on your network.
Yes, exactly.
But that means that vulnerabilities within the security appliance itself give an attacker a particularly privileged position and applies the security of the appliance itself is rather important and basically impacts the security of your entire network. So importantly, they gave 5 questions to ask the vendor of the security appliance before you buy it. The first one is, what third-party libraries interact directly with the incoming data, and what are the processes that the vendor has to react to security issues published in these libraries, right? When we get to the next story, we'll see one of the libraries is like libpng or something to be able to check if the file going through has any malicious stuff in it, right? It's like, well, every once in a while, there's a vulnerability in libpng.
Or there was one just this year in the JPEG library. I don't know if you remember, but yeah.
Right. And so how quickly is that going to get fixed? And how long is my security appliance going to have this known 0-day vulnerability sitting on it? And that all that someone has to do is email a JPEG to somebody at our company, and it's going to get scanned and explode. And
what you are touching on is when a vendor used to tell me, "Oh, we ship it with hardened Linux." In my mind, what I would hear was, "We ship it with unpatched Linux." We ship it
with Linux, kernel 2.2.
Yeah, 2.4 maybe now.
Deleted a bunch of packages from.
Yeah, and then but they're still using a ton of core libraries that are, if you got access to the box, their entire premise for these appliances is that you'll never get console access. That's their whole premise. And then if you get console access, it's a nightmare.
Because you emailed a JPEG to it.
Yeah, right. The big compromise.
Yeah. Are these third-party libraries sandboxed in a sandbox that's recognized as industry standard, right? Is it something you didn't just roll your own? The sandbox Google uses in Chrome and Adobe uses in Acrobat Reader are open source and have undergone a lot of scrutiny. So are the isolation features of KVM and QEMU, although QEMU's had a bunch of issues itself as well, right? And KVM and Zen. Are any third-party libraries running outside of that sandbox or some internal virtualization environment? If so, why? And what's the timeline to actually fix this? Because oftentimes some library will run outside the sandbox because it doesn't work in the sandbox. And the question is that a temporary fix, or do you plan to just leave it like that forever? And if they do, that kind of gives you a sign that they're really not looking at addressing that issue.
Absolutely.
Right? Third question, how much of the proprietary code runs, which directly interacts with incoming data, runs outside that sandbox? Because, sure, they might sandbox the open source library, but they probably assume all of their code is pristine and awesome and never going to have a problem.
Of course.
Meanwhile, it's like, well, if you're writing it, you can definitely write it to work in the sandbox, right? And then they also say, to what extent has this code that you wrote, the vendor wrote, actually been security reviewed by anyone that doesn't work at the vendor? Right?
Yeah, is it just is it your own internal team checking it, kind of a thing?
Yeah,
that's not necessarily sufficient for a border device like that, especially for an expensive one.
Is the vendor willing to provide a hard disk image for basic assessment by a third-party security consultancy? Right, if I'm going to spend all this money on your device, like some of these cost like $100,000 or something.
You think they would do that?
Depends.
I don't know.
It's like, can you give me a hard drive image of this so I could pay somebody 10 grand to look at it first and see if there's anything obviously wrong with it before I pay for it?
I feel like your best compromise, if it's a device like this, when they're expensive, they'll often let you demo it for a bit, and then you hire somebody to come in and audit it, or you have your own.
Sometimes the license doesn't let you do that though. So they say also misconfigured permissions that allow privilege escalation happen all too often. So basic permission lockdown should have happened on the appliance, but it doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, these companies make Linux appliances and don't understand basic Linux stuff.
I've seen it where they'll install their stuff to opt, and then they'll chmod at 777, and they're good to go. That's part of their installation process.
Yep. In the case of a breach at your company, so this is the company that the purchaser works at, what is the process through which your forensics team can acquire memory images and hard drive images from the appliance so that we can maybe see why it didn't detect it or how it was compromised or whatever? And not to mention, in the case of a breach at the vendor, what information could the attacker get about your appliance or your network or your security? How much does the appliance report back to the vendor? And, how much information does the vendor have? And does the vendor have some special secret support login to access your device remotely that the attacker might get access to if they hack the vendor?
Or a backdoor like we keep hearing about over and over again.
Yeah, exactly. Or, updates for the appliance are signed with some secret key by the vendor. And if someone were to break in, would they be able to issue a fake security advisor or security update and cause the firmware on your device to update itself to a compromised version?
Mm-hmm.
How do they deal with the trusted keys on their own network? And then a bonus question here. Does the vendor publish hashes of the packages they install on the appliance? So in case of a forensic investigation, it's easy to verify that the attacker has not replaced some of the libraries on the appliance.
That would be really nice. If you could actually get that from the vendor, that would be really nice.
Yeah. So they say, a vendor that takes their product quality and hence your data security seriously will be able to answer these questions and will be able to confidentially state that all third-party parsers in large fractions of their proprietary code run sandboxed or virtualized, and that the configuration of the machine has been reasonably locked down, and be willing to provide evidence of this. For example, a disk image or virtual appliance, like you're saying, a demo, along with permission for you to inspect it. Because, that last part can be a big thing.
Yeah. We both just dropped in the chat room because the chat room was asking for it.
Yeah. But yeah, so I think all these are very good questions, and I happen to know one vendor who answered a lot of those questions actually before I knew the guide. Otherwise, I would have literally just asked him these exact questions.
Oh, yeah. Very good.
But we interviewed a developer who has two security appliances, and he talks about how, they use Capsicum to sandbox the processes. So literally, for example, they have one part of the code where it intercepts all Microsoft Remote Desktop sessions, right? And it presents a login screen to the user, and it doesn't actually make the connection to the server inside your network until they get past that fake login screen. Well, that fake login screen runs Capsicum, so all it has is the connection to the user and a append-only connection to a log file. And I think the password or whatever. It doesn't actually have the ability to reach that Windows server or the appliance itself. All it has is the ability to receive stuff from the user, send stuff back to the user, and log, right? And then approve the connection or not based on its exit status. On top of being Capsicumized, so it's locked down like that, it also is limited. It only gets 2 seconds of CPU time. Oh. So if you did somehow compromise it and make it do something else or try to brute force it or something, it would just be restricted, not allowed to do anything because it's not allowed more CPU time.
That's pretty clever.
Pretty good. Lots of cool stuff. Yeah. Anyway, it's definitely worth checking out the interview.
That'd be episode 120 of the BSD Now program, which we normally would plug in a little bit, but now it seems like a natural time. So go grab it. Go get the HD version, right? I mean, Alan's got that nice 930E, right?
Yep.
And he records locally. So you get the full Jude experience. You get high definition. All right, Alan, any other thoughts on that story?
No, that's it for that one.
All right, well then I will take a moment and tell you about my mobile phone. I'm going to tell you about Ting. This is how I kind of figured out a little deal that I want to share with the world. Go to right now, techsnap.ting.com right now, won't you? So that way you support the TechSNAP program and you get yourself a nice discount off your first Ting device and if you have a compatible and a Ting credit. But here is what I want to tell you. Ting is mobile that makes sense. They just take your minutes, your messages and your megabytes, and they add them all up, and whatever you pay, or whatever you use, that's what you pay. It's really pretty straightforward. And here's the brilliant part. It's $6 a line, so you can have multiple devices. Maybe one's a phone and one's a tablet. You have a kid, or you have an employee, or you have a significant other that you'd like to give a phone to for the holidays. It's just going to be $6 and then the usage on top of that. What I find brilliant about this is when I was on the road trip, I used more. And so my Ting bill cost more. But when I'm just pretty Wi-Fi savvy and do most of my downloads before I hit the road, my Ting bill is less. And what's brilliant about that is that means 1 month out of the year, maybe I'll pay slightly more. But 11 months out of the year, I'm paying like $40 a month, $45 a month for 3 smartphones. It's a really great deal. You can get started by going to techsnap.ting.com. They have an awesome dashboard. They have a CDMA and GSM network, so you can just kind of be a little savvy and pick where your phone's going to go, what's going to give you the best. And they have a brand new phone that just hit the Ting store, and these are all unlocked. You get them, they're unlocked, you own them, $183, no contract, no early termination fee. For the LG Volt 2, which just hit the store today, a 5-inch display, tri-band LTE, it's got 5.1 on the Android up there up in the Lollipop biz, it's got an HD screen, quad-core Snapdragon processor, and then you don't have to worry about carriers getting in the way of your updates. It's just a really great phone with a really great price with no contract, and you just pay for what you use. Of course, they've got all the devices. You can find all the great devices, and they also sell just CDMA or GSM SIM cards. So there's a lot of good options for you. Start by going to techsnap.ting.com. Techsnap.ting.com, go check them out. Try out their dashboard. It's pretty kick-ass. And I think you will agree if you try their savings calculator. Just click right there, boop, 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 boop. Put your actual usage in there and see how much you would save. About every 2 years, I save about $2,000 over what I switched from. And it's been pretty nice because as I started to get a couple of people at Jupiter Broadcasting that I wanted to give phone lines to, it was really obvious how to do it. Just $6 more, and we added another line. And what's really great is a lot of people who join us, they'll bring a mobile device with them. They'll have a cell phone already because cell phones have been around for a while now, and Ting has CDMA and GSM networks, so it's really, really great. And if you go to techsnap.ting.com, if you bring a phone, you get $25 in service credit, and that's probably going to pay for more than your first month, especially if you can take advantage of their early termination relief program. And then if you look into the referral programs, if you refer to somebody, well, you could probably go like 3 months without having to pay a cell bill. There is a way to do it. It's pretty cool. You just have to be a little savvy. That's why they picked our audience, techsnap.ting.com. Go over there and try them out, techsnap.ting.com. And a big thank you to Ting for sponsoring the TechSNAP program. You still have that big Nexus 6 there, Mr. Jude?
Oh, yes.
How are you liking that big phone?
Loving it.
I am in the market for a new phone.
Just got my 2nd December security update.
I busticated my phone up super bad a while ago, and so I've been kind of like slowly shopping, and I'm kind of leaning again going with the Nexus, but I haven't made up my mind yet.
Yep. You can see here my prompt to download Android 6.0.1.
Ooh, you gonna do it? We should do it. Do it.
I have 6.0.0 already. This is just a security update.
Yeah, who needs patches? Who needs patches?
Well, it's kind of what we were talking about the other day about how it's like, well, I'm kind of busy doing TechSNAP today, so I don't have time to screw with my phone. So I'm not going to install the security update until after the show's over later tonight when I'm not expecting any more calls.
Yeah. All right, Alan, well, our next story sort of fits beautifully with our previous story, doesn't it?
Our whole little theme today.
Yeah, tell me about it.
So yes, we just talked about Fireeye doing all this cool security research, and then about security appliance questions you should ask and so on. So now Google's Project Zero has done an audit of Fireeye's security appliance.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah, so Fireeye sell security appliances to enterprise and government customers. Fireeye's flagship products are monitoring devices designed to be installed at the egress point of large networks. So basically, if you have a high-end managed switch, it has a feature where you can say, hey, port number 7 is actually a mirror or monitor or a span or whatever you want to call it, depending on which company you bought the switch from. Basically, all the traffic that's going to go out a certain port, or it can actually be a couple of ports, will all have a second copy of all the bytes sent to a different port. Part of the reason for this is, I'm the network administrator and I'm trying to debug some network issue. So all the traffic that's going over there, also make a copy come to this port, which is my laptop, so I can run Wireshark and see what's going on, right? or stuff like that. In this case, you install this appliance on this monitor port, and it gets a copy of all traffic coming from the internet into your company, right? Or you can also have it going out as well. So it can inspect everything that everybody on the network is trying to do, or out to the internet anyway. So the Fireeye device then watches all network traffic passively, monitoring common protocols like HTTP, FTP, SMTP, etc., for any transferred files. If a file transfer is detected, for example, an email attachment or you're downloading something from a website, the Fireeye appliance extracts the file and scans it for malware. If it detects the malware, it alerts the security team. It says, hey, somebody's sending malware to you, right? Although you can also put the device in an IPS or intrusion prevention system mode, where it actually kind of, instead of being on the side as a tap, it's in the middle of the flow so that it can block the traffic if it detects the malware. So depending which way you set it up, it's either it's a wiretap or it's physically inline filtering your internet connection.
Right. Okay.
So for networks with deployed Fireeye devices, a vulnerability that can be exploited via the passive monitoring interface would be a nightmare scenario, right? So your device is sitting there as a tap, and somehow you can send data to a user in the network, and in the process, exploit the monitoring device.
Sure.
This would mean an attacker would only have to send an email to a user to gain access to a persistent network tap. The recipient, the user, wouldn't even have to have read the email or opened an attachment or anything. Just the fact that the email was sent and received by the mail server at the company or whatever would be enough to compromise the device. Right? And then if you compromise one of these devices, you're basically sitting on a wiretap for their entire network. Especially some of these devices, again, referring back to the BSD Now episode, one of the appliances that the Powell was talking about was one that can decrypt SSL traffic.
Right. Yeah. We have listeners who work at companies that happens for all their web traffic and all their.
Right. There's quite a few, and a lot of those appliances are really bad at security. So Powell's company has built this one that's better at it.
Okay.
And it does things like a lot of those other. So those appliances, basically, what they do is they intercept your request out, and then make it on your behalf, and basically to defeat the normal man-in-the-middle protection from SSL, they will re-sign the certificate. They'll re-encrypt all the data with a certificate that's only trusted by your company, right? So the appliance has a private key for the My Big Enterprise CA, which gets installed on all the computers in the company, and so you don't get the SSL scary warning that you would normally get during a man-in-the-middle attack because you trust the man in the middle in this case because it's an appliance you installed or your IT department anyway.
It's our big security solution, Alan.
Yeah, but some of those appliances don't actually consider whether you would have trusted the original certificate or not. So, right, if the original certificate is self-signed or the original certificate should throw an error because of a man-in-the-middle attack, some of these appliances will just sign that bogus certificate and make you trust it even though it shouldn't have been trusted.
Right.
Or won't regenerate it properly, and so will make an expired certificate look like it's new, or one that's all kinds of other strange scenarios. Anyway, so with Powell's device sitting in front of the Fireeye device, it would intercept and decrypt even encrypted traffic. So now, if you manage to compromise this Fireeye device, you would have not only access to view everything going back and forth across the network, you would get the decrypted view of all of it.
Yeah.
All the SSL, TLS, webs, HTTPS, the encrypted email, everything that the Lynx device could decrypt, you would be able to see if you can compromise the Fireeye device.
And it would be basically anything that goes through the operating system, because the way that a lot of these devices work is you usually install something on the workstation, so that way the device and the workstation trust the device on the network.
Right. So you install
it could be everything.
You trust the root certificate on each client device, each phone and each computer.
It could be every chat.
So basically this sits, right behind the modem before the router or whatever, and sees every single byte of traffic that's going out to the internet. And, in the case of the Lynx, can decrypt it and then pass it off to the Fireeye. So, This device basically has access to everything on your network. It basically has better than NSA level access because
Yeah.
you've trusted its certificate so we can decrypt everything.
Yeah, they
It
don't
doesn't
have to break
brute force
anything. It just does it.
Yeah. So yes, better than NSA level spying access to your whole network if they can compromise this Fireeye device. So yeah, a network tap is one of the most privileged machines on the network with access to your employees' emails, their passwords, downloads, browser history, confidential attachments, files, everything. Even in this, in the case of links, even encrypted things. So in some deployment configurations, the attacker could tamper with the traffic, right? If you have it installed as the IPS, where the traffic is being filtered through the device instead of just monitored by it.
Right, sure.
It means, if it has the ability to block the traffic, it could also change it. So it could inject a backdoor into a legitimate email. Or, some attachment that you're expecting and are supposed to open and is from a trusted person, I could replace the PDF with an infected one. Right? Or whatever.
Yeah.
So now I can compromise all the machines in your office by using your security device against you.
Yeah. Ironic.
Yep. And then worse, because the Fireeye device normally has a separate interface that goes off to the internet. So even when it's only in tap mode and can't monitor or can't change the traffic, it can still reach out to the internet to, say, send a copy of all the data that's going back and forth out to the bad guy, or to actually make this wormable, to make it spread between your offices or whatever. So Google found such a flaw in the Fireeye device.
I bet Fireeye loved that.
Fireeye has issued a patch for the vulnerability, and customers who have not updated should do so immediately to protect their infrastructure. Devices with security content release 427.334 and higher have the issue resolved. So they have a bunch of Q&A stuff on their website. I picked out two important ones here. So these are things that you might want to know if you were going to buy one of these devices.
Sure.
So Google says, how long did Fireeye take to resolve the issue after it was reported by Google? Fireeye responded very quickly, pushing out temporary mitigations to customers within hours of a report and resolving the issue completely within 2 days.
All right.
So all of a sudden that price tag seems a little more worth it.
Yeah, legitimately.
And then they mentioned, have Fireeye supported your security research? And the answer is yes. Fireeye has been very cooperative. They worked with us closely and provided the test equipment support and responded very quickly to any issues we reported. So it turns out Fireeye actually gave Google the device and asked them to do it.
Oh, I respect that a lot.
So Project Zero has been evaluating a Fireeye NX7500 appliance and created a lab to generate sample traffic. The test environment consisted of a workstation with 4 network interfaces. 2 of these network interfaces were connected to a hub so that they would basically simulate a tap instead of having to buy a fancy network switch. A hub is basically a switch that doesn't have a brain, and so every packet that comes in on one port gets sent out every other port. Whereas a switch is usually smart and says, "Oh, I know which port. I see the MAC address you're trying to talk to. I'm going to only send it out the port that machine's on," and it increases the speed of your network, but makes it harder to monitor. So anyway, so the Fireeye passive monitoring interface called PEther3 was connected to a third port on that hub, and basically that's how they cheated to make a mirror port off, a $10 hub they got on eBay instead of paying $3,000 for a fancy switch. They did it so they could observe traffic being exchanged between the 2 interfaces on the test machine. This simulates, an internet user receiving email or downloading something from the internet. And they go on to describe their whole lab setup and all the configuration of everything, so you could actually build this at your office if you had one of these, or if you have, say, a different brand of security appliance and you want to run the same test.
Yes, that seems very likely.
So the main analysis performed by the Fireeye appliance are monitoring for known malicious traffic. So they have, a list of blacklisted networks they don't let through, certain domain names that are associated with malware, snort rules, static analysis of files, like running it through an antivirus, the Yara rules, analysis scripts, and so on. And finally, tracing the execution of transfer files in instrumented virtual machines. So it might actually fire up a virtual machine and run the code, like the attached file, and see what it does. And if it does something bad, it'll block it, and otherwise it'll allow it. Once an execution trace has been performed, pattern matching against known bad behaviors is performed. So they have this malware input processor subsystem is responsible for the static analysis of files, invoking little helper programs and plugins to decode various file types. So this is where a lot of the open source stuff comes in. For example, there's an SWF helper file for checking flash files, and it uses FLASM to disassemble flash files and figure out what they do.
Clever.
Or it uses P7zip to open up the DMG files to check, Mac OS disk images for problems. Or uses PNG check to check PNG files for malformed images or otherwise possibly malicious stuff that's trying to target PNG. There's also a jar helper that is used to analyze captured Java archives, which checks for signatures using jar signer and then attempts to decompile the contents using an open source Java decompiler called Jode, Jode. The problem is that the Jode decompiler actually executes small bits of the Java code to try to deobfuscate it. Right? Oftentimes a string in the Java, instead of just writing it out, they'll do a function call to base64 encode or something to make it harder to figure out what's actually happening there. So running that little bit of the middle code there will make it obvious what it's doing. So that's what this Jode thing does. But then Google's like, with some trial and error, we were actually able to construct a class that Jode would execute and when used it, would invoke java.lang.runtime.exec, which would allow us to execute arbitrary shell commands. This worked during our tests, and we were able to execute commands just by transferring jars across the passively monitored interface. So if I just email you a jar, and you don't even get it, maybe it gets blocked by your mail server because who's going to email a .jar file, right? Or whatever. But just because that jar file transited your network, it now infects the Fireeye device and makes it run whatever command I want it to run. So they say,
That's all it takes.
as the Fireeye ships with Netcat installed by default, creating a back connect shell is as simple as specifying the command we want and the address of our control server. So because the Fireeye has a separate port that goes out to the internet, it may be behind a firewall, but usually firewalls allow stuff inside to connect out, but not outside to connect in.
Yeah.
So you just make the Fireeye device call up your control server on a certain port and open a shell for you. And then now you have a shell and you do whatever you want on the Fireeye device. Says we now have code execution as the user MIP, or malware input processor. The MIP user is quite privileged and capable of accessing sensitive network data like IP addresses and stuff. However, and then there's a giant chunk of redacted stuff in the
blocked out
in the web page.
Yeah, there it is. Right
there's a very simple privilege escalation to get root access. It's like, oh, so Fireeye's requested additional time to prepare a fix for that privilege escalation component of the attack. Yeah, and so we don't have the details on that part yet. But they go on to talk about in the Java, basically. To exploit this, they custom constructed a jar in such a way that it's not something you could actually compile with real Java. They had to use a separate tool to make this malicious jar, but they have the source code and everything for it. And basically, by just feeding this through the malware analyzer, it would run that Java code and give you access to it. The very interesting thing is, I'm wondering how many other security appliances do the same thing with the Java jars.
I suppose many of them might if they're trying to figure out what something a hidden Java thing could be.
Yeah, so it would be interesting to see. Oh, it turns out 40% of all security appliances do this. And although inspecting jars is slightly sophisticated, and maybe some of them some of the cheaper ones might not do it, but it's nice that Google gave out the source code for their test jar so that all those vendors could actually try it against their own device and maybe get a patch out for it before somebody else figures out that their device is vulnerable.
Yeah.
But they say this allows exfiltration of confidential data, right? Because basically you sit there and monitor all emails that come in and send a copy of them back out to your control server. Or tampering with traffic, right? If it's installed in that IPS mode, I could change every time you try to go to the real Google, I could send you to a fake Google that runs malware ads or whatever.
Yeah.
Allow lateral movement across the network. Turns out the Fireeye device is allowed to, call up other machines on our network and do whatever it wants, or make a self-propagating internet worm. And then Google has a note at the bottom here. If you'd like to read more about our series of attacks against security products, they've also published research into ESET, Kaspersky, Sophos, Avast, and more. So there's links at the bottom of that Google Doc there to pretty much all your favorite security vendors and what Google has found is wrong with their stuff.
Yeah, holy
The important lesson here is that, nothing is perfect, but we see that some companies respond better, right? Fireeye seemed to be very quick to respond.
Within hours, they had some mitigation patches. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, and actually it solved the main part of the problem within 2 days, which is very responsive. In the roundup, I think we have a story about Microsoft working on something for a couple months and deciding, we don't think we actually want to fix that.
No bigs.
Just literally closing the bug with won't fix. Yeah, quite a bit different behaviors there. But anyway, I thought that was a cool story. Just because how he's like, oh, I could just email somebody a jar and take over their entire network even if they don't open the file.
Well, Mr. Jude, now we all just became a little more paranoid about that device we thought was going to make us more secure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Any other thoughts on that story?
No.
All right. Well, then I'll tell you about DigitalOcean, my go-to infrastructure on demand. DigitalOcean.com. Use the promo code SNAPOcean and get a $10 credit. They've got a bunch of great rigs you can deploy in less than 55 seconds. They're dedicated to offering the most intuitive and easy way for you to spin up your own cloud server. You can get started in less than 55 seconds, and pricing plans start at only $5. $5. You get 512 megabytes of RAM, a 20 gigabyte SSD, 1 CPU, and a terabyte of transfer. Terabyte! I love that. And they got data centers in New York, San Francisco, Singapore, Amsterdam, London, Germany, brand new one in Toronto. And they have an awesome interface to manage all of it. This is really what's made me feel like I could just go to them and deploy on demand. I mean, yeah, they have SSDs throughout, so everything's super fast. They got great connections. They have tier 1 data centers. But this interface is very simple yet extremely powerful. It's really a privilege to be able to have something like that, to manage something as complicated as virtual machines all over the world, one-click deployment of applications, snapshots, backups, and then to make it all better, they have an incredible, straightforward, and simple API with lots of open source code already created for you to take advantage of right now. So you can get really productive really fast. Also, if there isn't something you can one-click deploy or create with their API or take advantage of code that already exists, they also have a bunch of killer tutorials. This is a nice practical one. How to upgrade PHP 7 on Ubuntu 14.04. Really well done, very clearly written. Look at this. Look at this quality of documentation. And there's just a tip of the iceberg. There is a ton of good stuff over at DigitalOcean. They pay for it. They have professional editors. They pay community members up to $200 for some of the tutorials that are written. It's a really cool company. And you can use our promo code SNAPOcean to try out that $5 rig 2 months for free. I've been using it for Minecraft, SyncThing, OwnCloud, BitTorrent Sync, FTP storage, a Stun server. I mean, a Nicecast server at one point, or Icecast, using Nicecast to transmit to it. Mm-hmm. The list goes on, and it is always a ton of fun. Even just updating the packages on a DigitalOcean droplet is a lot of fun. Go to DigitalOcean.com and use the promo code SNAPOcean. And a big thank you to DigitalOcean for sponsoring the TechSNAP program. And don't forget, Alan Jude recommends you deploy FreeBSD. I believe that's true.
Sure.
I believe that's true.
Yeah.
I believe that's true.
And we've had a tutorial on BSD now in the past about how to do OpenBSD. And we just got emailed today instructions on how to do NetBSD.
Really?
Yeah, somebody figured it out.
I love it. I'm going to give, since we gave a plug to BSD now, I'm going to give a plug to episode 170 of Unfiltered called Terragram, the last Unfiltered of the year. Mr. Chase is back. And we covered some clips about U.S. officials talking about how we need to go after encryption in 2016. We got to solve this encryption problem. So we spent some time talking about that in 170 of the Unfiltered show, which I think some of you might find interesting.
Great response to that coming up in the roundup, too.
Okay, very good. There's your pluggy plug. Now, with the news all done, it's time for the TechSNAP feedback. Thanks for sending your emails to techsnap@jupiterbroadcasting.com or pop in that contact link at the top of the Jupiter Broadcasting website, or even better, starting a thread in our subreddit over at techsnap.reddit.com. Our first email comes in from Jacob, and Jacob Has a RAID repair gone wrong? He said, I've been listening since episode 1, and this is the show I recommend to all the IT folks who work for me, all 87 of them. The smart ones take the time to watch and listen. Hopefully this the request for help won't embarrass me too much. Oh, look at him taking one right there in front of the team. He says, I had a LaCie 28 gig drive set up as a RAID 1 off of Mac with 3 4 terabyte drives.
I think this is too big, as in that's the name of the enclosure.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
It's an enclosure with 3 4 terabyte drives in it.
Yeah.
And he set them up so he actually has a 3-drive mirror, so he only gets 4 terabytes of storage, but on 3 copies of every block.
I saw.
Anyway.
And he says it didn't work out so well. The drive worked. The drive from work removed all the data and new photos we put on it. It was a doomsday scenario. I quarantined the problem by removing the other drive from the slot and put in a single good drive with photos, so my wife could continue working. I called the Mac tech support and was on the line for an hour. I got escalated twice and finally a technician in their enterprise area. One of the first things he told me was software RAID has been removed from the latest version of OS X because they found it was unreliable. No one was willing to guarantee I could put a drive back in and get the setup working the way I wanted. I've now secured a device that holds the 3rd drive and have begun to manually back up the photos. All I need to make the redundancy automatic. All I need to do is make redundancy automatic going forward. What should I use? Should I cron a bash script to copy it over? Should I use SyncThing? In the house, I've got a MacBook Air and a T420 running Ubuntu Mate, the Mac Mini, and a FreeNAS box using an old System 76 Meerkat. Well, that's pretty cool. And 3 MacBook Pros. The T420 gets used as the MB server for a family car rides, thanks to the Rover experience. That was inspiration. And log rides are much nicer now with the 4 kids. Please be mindful of a budget when proposing a solution. I think I already have the tools I need. I just need to configure in the smartest way possible. So this happened after he decided to rotate the drives, he said.
Yeah. So the problem with doing a plan like this with something other than ZFS is because of the lack of the metadata, it can't know which drive has the newest data. Right? So normally how it should work is if you got the 3 drives, you pull out one, and you leave it at work, and you bring it back a month later, and when you put it in, it should realize, oh, this drive is old, and it would overwrite everything on it by copying the files from the other 2 drives.
Okay.
But apparently that's not what happened. When you put it in, it was like, oh, look, file system, and it doesn't have any of the files. Or whatever. The advantage to ZFS is instead of having to overwrite the entire drive with a copy of the first 2, it would be able to say, oh, I see you're at transaction group X. I'm going to copy everything that's newer than that to the drive, but not everything, which oftentimes can be faster, especially if you, say, rotate once a week or something. But it really depends how it's set up. Yeah, with RAID 1, they're not separate devices, and the OS has no idea what's going on. So yeah, you can do something like an rsync or a SyncThing or something, but yeah, it gets pretty messy pretty quick. Luckily now there is ZFS for OS X, and you can do it that way. But I've only ever put this into, like theoretically, I've never actually done the whole rotate one drive out of a 3D mirror to create that kind of tape archive looking thing. So yeah, I don't know what to say. ZFS has some extra support for that. It also has the ability what's called a split of a pool. So if you have a pool made up of mirrors of enough drives, you can say split, and it'll take one drive out of each VDEV and make a new pool. Basically allows you to fork the entire pool. And so basically one drive from each VDEV, and you get a second completely separate pool.
Here's where I'm confused.
Yeah, the story kind of...
So why is he... So he tried with this LaCie 2 big drive, right? RAID 1. Then he... So why not? Why are we hanging toy hard drives off of a toy computer? Why not just hook up big hard drives to the FreeNAS that he has on the Meerkat? Or what did he say it was? It was a Meerkat? Yeah. He's got a System 76 Meerkat running FreeNAS. Hook it up to that. Don't even bother with the Mac at all. Put ZFS on that sucker and then just do a network drive to that thing. Is that not doable for some reason?
That would probably be a lot better. And then you could ZFS replicate or something.
Yeah, because I think where you're going in is don't use the Mac as a primary way to store files. Use the Mac as a primary way to access and interact with the files, but don't use it as the primary storage server for the files because they have a joke file system from the 80s that they don't bother investing in. And you can see how they literally just rewrote.
This close to having ZFS and then got scared off by Oracle.
Yeah. And they did it. They literally.
If they had been a little bit faster and done it while Sun was still separate.
And it's more egregious.
OS 10 would be like ridiculously good.
With this El Capitan release they have now, they just did a drive-by rewrite of their entire disk management utility, and most of the functionality now is not even available in the application. You have to drop to the command line. It's a no-win scenario, and it is not an area. Yeah. Apple is more interested in selling you PCI SSDs that max out at a terabyte than they are worried about you managing multi-drive setups with RAID. That's just not where their focus is anymore. And so I would just avoid that altogether.
Say what Chris is saying, take the Meerkat, set it up as ZFS, then you can have, say, an external drive or something that you take to the office, and you just ZFS send the data from your FreeNAS internal mirroring to this external drive, or 2 drives, or whatever you want to do, and then take that with you. And when you bring it back, you just do incremental ZFS replication to get caught up. And, it probably only take, a couple hours, right? You can set up run overnight, and you can copy gigs and gigs of data, no problem, and then just take it to work with you again.
Yeah. And, of course, the Mac could do an SMB or NFS mount to the FreeNAS rig. All right, Scott.
Yeah. So best bet there definitely is keep everything on the FreeNAS and use ZFS replication to an external drive or a separate FreeNAS, and problem solved.
Absolutely. Okay, now, Scott writes in, with an ad blocking at the pfSense level question, he says, do you know of any recent how-to articles on ad blocking with pfSense for your home network? Thanks, and rock on. What do you think about blocking?
There's a couple different ways. So a lot of the older type of advertising blocking was basically a giant blacklist, and those can often be fed into pfSense. Part of the problem can be, in your typical firewall, you're basically looking at layer 3. So you base your decisions on like IP addresses and maybe port numbers. So you can't necessarily tell something is an ad just from that, right? If you want to block all of Google's ads, you can't just block all of Google, because then you'll be like, oh, my internet doesn't work. Yeah. I can't access YouTube or Google or Google Docs. Or
and a lot of people will use like Squid in combination with pfSense, and there's a lot of Squid lists out there that are fairly dynamic and updated, but you still have to manage it. What would you recommend?
And then there's you have a link here to the pfSense site where they have PF Blocker.
Yeah.
Which is specifically designed to assign many IP address URL lists, and it will like iBlock, and it will.
And also with this one in the pfSense forums, there is several community posts on like crowdsourced lists that are being fairly maintained. So that might be a way to go. The other way would be a little OpenDNS, using OpenDNS as the DNS server for the pfSense box and doing it at the OpenDNS level as well.
Do they have an ad blocking thing? I know they have a malware blocking thing, but I don't know about ads.
I specifically know they have a malware. I'm not so sure about ads. But I would like to know, techsnap.reddit.com, if you guys have a solution. That would be really cool.
Okay. Well, somebody just linked one in the chat room, so I will drop that in the show notes.
Nice.
As well.
Yeah, that's using Squid. Yeah, that would be nice. All right, so...
the advantage of doing Squid, basically, is that you get basically, you're inspecting at layer 7, so it actually is looking at HTTP and can make a decision about, this connection to Google is normal and this connection to Google is an ad, and so on.
Now, we have a question about how feasible it would be to set up a passwordless system with some expectations that I might need to set up computers for someone with Alzheimer's. I would like to give them a solution that's very effective for remembering passwords. As a result, I was wondering whether I could manage all passwords through keys and maybe even biometrics, something like that. Do you guys know where to get instructions to make a password manager in a system adapt to such a measure? Or maybe is it even possible in the first place? Something he's kind of looking for is password managers that set up a master password from biometrics or texting a cell phone, login through biometrics, keys, or some sort of auto login. I'm planning on to use only the only OS which are Libre open source, so it has to be something that would work with KDE, no mate as a desktop environment, etc. He says, I'm okay with the root password in a post-it note inside the computer case for service purposes, if that's the best we can get. Other questions, which models of biometric readers would people recommend and any potential pitfalls I should watch out for? This is an open thread on our subreddit too, so if anybody has anything that they have out in the audience, I would love to hear more. But what are your thoughts initially, like with biometrics and that kind of stuff?
So I, played with biometrics way too many years ago now. I had the little APC fingerprint scanner, and it worked fairly well But the one that killed it for me is that their software only worked with Internet Explorer, not with Firefox.
Yikes.
And so when I think Firefox 2.0 came out and I switched to Firefox, or maybe it was 1.6, I forget. Anyway, when I switched to Firefox, that was enough that I kind of stopped using it. Although that was then followed by an episode of the Mythbusters where they took the specific fingerprint scanner I had and proved that you could beat it with Jello. No, sorry. Other ones were Jello. Mine was the most complicated. They actually had to do like a PCB where they had my fingerprints, like something that actually had the ridges and stuff. Whereas some of the worst ones, they had like the one that was just like a lock on a door. They beat it by a photocopy of your fingerprint, and then licking the piece of paper was enough to make it let you through.
Oh, no.
Because it's like the paper didn't conduct electricity like your finger did, so it wouldn't work. But if you licked it, then it would. Oh, I don't imagine how bad licking a photocopy of a fingerprint is.
Yuck.
But yeah, a lot of the older biometric stuff was pretty jokey. Nowadays, I don't know. I would say Noah would probably say something about the YubiKey.
Yeah, Noah and the chat room are definitely mentioning the YubiKey. I would say I have seen many tutorials on integrating different types of biometrics with PAM. So I guess just on a broad level, to answer some of your bigger questions, you're not going to integrate it in so much, I would assume, with GNOME or KDE.
So I think on the local computer, you could probably get away with blank password on almost everything and just not do it.
Yeah.
Because as long as other people don't have physical access to the system.
Right.
That's not the worry in this case.
To get them
then it's just how do you manage the master password for your LastPass or other password method?
Yeah, I know. Like on the phone, LastPass will support fingerprint reading. I don't.
If your phone has it built in.
Yeah. But so what he needs to focus on though is figuring out whatever biometric solution or password solution he's going to use, how it integrates in with PAM if he's using Linux. Because that's what's going to authenticate the login for the desktop environments and stuff.
But you can just set up auto login and blank passwords whatever on the local system.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be that worried about that part. It just comes down to what's going to enter the master password into KeyPass or LastPass, and
YubiKey.
or replacing those with the biometric based authentication.
YubiKey really could be a big solution here.
Although the big question is, how do you avoid them forgetting where they put the YubiKey?
We'll just leave it in the USB port.
I suppose.
And then you just take it out only on special occasions.
Right. And that might be the best bet.
Yeah.
I
suppose so.
The other pitfall I was thinking of that.
Other than there's no physical security.
Yeah. Oh, the other one I saw that was mostly gimmicky, I think it was on ThinkGeek. And I think I don't remember if it ever worked for Linux or if it was like one specific version that they got it to work for, and if you used anything else, you were on your own. But they had this thing that was like a belt thing that went on your belt, and if you were within like 5 meters of your computer, it unlocked it, and if you walked away, it auto locked it.
They still have that with apps on the phone. I don't know how reliable they are but they do have that.
If it's checking your location constantly to do that, how much battery drain is that?
Well, the one I'm thinking of, I think uses when you come in Bluetooth range, it unlocks, and when you leave Bluetooth range, it locks.
That makes more sense.
That would just work for the desktop again. That's not going to solve. What you really need is like LastPass and YubiKey.
Yeah, that seems like the best approach. But hopefully someone from the chat room has an even better idea and puts it in the subreddit.
Yep, techsnap.reddit.com. Mr. E writes in with our last email of the day. He says, greetings from Ecuador. Woohoo! Look at that. He says, hello, Chris and Alan. I'm a big fan of your show. I'm a mechatronics engineer. Am I getting that right, Alan? Mechatronics?
What is it?
Mechatronics engineer. And I have a question. We have a set of devices sending TCP/IP streams to a fixed public IP4 address server. Due to maintenance issues, oh boy, don't I know that one. We would like to be able to temporarily relay the stream of data to a different server without needing to change the fixed IP address on the devices. In a way, redirecting the data depending on which server is currently up. What would be the best way to do this? How could I address this issue if my servers are running on DigitalOcean? Thanks for your feedback and the wonderful show. I've been listening for years.
Okay, so I forget what it's called on Linux. On BSD, we have what's called CARP, or the Common Address Redundancy Protocol.
Oh, yeah.
So your two servers would have their own IP addresses, maybe even internal ones or whatever, and then they basically would share that public IP address, and they just communicate with each other, and whichever one comes up first is the master, and the other one sits there as a slave and keeps pinging the master.
Right, what is that for Linux?
The master
is it CARP on Linux too?
No, it's called something else. Cisco calls it VRRP, the Virtual Address Redundancy Protocol.
Yeah, come on,
or virtual router redundancy protocol, VRRP. On Linux, I think you have something, but I have no idea what it's called.
Yeah.
But there's probably something similar. So that's an approach. Interestingly, he mentioned DigitalOcean.
I was gonna say, yeah.
They in DigitalOcean recently just introduced a new feature called floating IPs, which is designed exactly for your situation.
This is not part of the this is not part of the ad read. This is just
I know. This is literally a feature they have where you have that one IP address and you can just move it to a different one of your VMs so that you can do maintenance. And
awesome.
On BSD Now we've talked about, so I have this machine here and I want to upgrade the software on it. So what I'm going to do is take a snapshot of it, clone it, and install the update on the clone and get it all set up. And once it's working, I just flip the IP address over to the clone,
right,
and let some traffic at it. Make sure it works.
Right.
If something goes wrong, I can just flip back to the old one. If nothing does go wrong, I can just delete the old one because I don't need it anymore. And next time, repeat the same situation. The CARP or VRRP or floating IPs, and they're Amazon calls them elastic IPs. OVH calls them something else. I can't remember now. But yeah, there are a bunch of other providers, including DigitalOcean, that offer these floating IP type thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or a lot of routers can do it with VRRP, and I know FreeBSD can, and OpenBSD can do it with CARP. And I imagine there's a Linux solution. I just don't know it. Sorry.
Maybe one day we should do TechSNAP from Ecuador. What do you think, Alan? I say after we hit TechSNAP 300, we do the whole thing from the road. We just go on a worldwide tour. I will find some sponsor to pay for it, and we'll have to get a staff.
I think you're going to need more than one.
Well, yeah. Well, we'll also need a staff so that way you can continue to work and we continue show production. So both of us will have to. But it's gonna be a blitz, Alan. It's gonna be this podcasting.
The episode we record in the business class of a Dreamliner will be quite interesting.
Right. Yeah. I'm told that podcasting is making big bucks these days. So I'm sure our money is just right around the corner.
I saw some giant map of the podcast network and my face wasn't on it and I was disappointed.
You know how many podcasts can say they've gone 245 weeks in a row without ever missing a beat? How many?
Not many that I know of. Most of them, most podcasts that start can't do 5 episodes ever, but
yeah, there would be an interesting stat on that. Yeah. All right, well, we need your feedback because guess what? We just keep on going. So go over to jupiterbroadcasting.com/contact and choose TechSNAP from the dropdown, and then send in your questions about security, about networking, about storage. No ZFS questions this week, so send in your questions about that. Although we did have a ZFS related way to solve the problem, and of course there's the subreddit.
No matter what your problem is, ZFS is the solution.
And then honestly, another great way to genuinely interact with us is to hang out in our live chat room over at jblive.tv. We do this show on Thursdays. We are normally 1 p.m. Pacific, which is
4 p.m. Eastern, 2100 UTC.
Yeah, and I'm going to mention it right now. We won't be live next week. I'll try to remember to mention it at the end of the episode too. But next week we are pre-recorded. We're going to have 2 pre-recorded episodes. Alan's gone through and picked some of his favorite moments from TechSNAP history, and we're going to feature those in 2 sort of back-to-back episodes that are like condensed TechSNAP goodness. I'm actually really looking.
I put fresh content in each one as well.
That is actually true. There's going to be
For Christmas, it's some of my favorite things from TechSNAP ever. Yeah. And then for the one on New Year's Eve, it's a retrospective of all the shit that went down in 2015.
There you go. So we should be 2 really good episodes. So that'll be at 246 and 247. That'll just be out at the regular Thursday time. All right, So now all that's left is the roundup after you go send us your feedback. So pause the show, go email your question in because I don't want you to forget it, and then hit play because guess what? It's time for the TechSNAP Roundup. Welcome to the TechSNAP Roundup. Yeah, that's what that crazy music means. Now, the Roundup are stories that just didn't quite fit at the top of the show because that was already a huge show. But there's some links we want you to be able to follow up on after the show, some things we're going to go through with you, and a lot of these links, well, maybe not this week, but often these links come from our subreddit at techsnap.reddit.com. And this first one is a good follow-up to our top story last week. You'll have to excuse me, Shockwave Flash has just crashed, and I'll go ahead and close that. So what's this about Satoshi's PGP keys being backdated? What the hell is that, Alan?
After Wired and Gizmodo did their little bit on who they thought Satoshi was, motherboard.vice.com did some checking in it, and looked at somebody had taken an archive of the MIT PGP server to do some science on or something. And in their archive, the Satoshi keys weren't there, suggesting that the keys have been added since then, which I think was 2012 or something, suggesting that the keys aren't as old as they look. Because turns out you can, if you just set your computer's clock to a date and create a key, the key will claim to be from that date, right? The other evidence they had for it was looking at some of the deeper settings in the PGP key, like which hashing algorithm it used and which things it allows. And they noticed that some of these keys seem to have features that didn't exist in PGP at the time, or in GPG at the time when the key was supposedly made.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They do note that it's weird that the keys are 3K. They're 3072 bit, so they're not, the 1024, the first key that people used to use. But you remember after Snowden, everybody went to like 4096 keys. Mm-hmm. They're 3072, which is kind of a weird thing.
It would be Satoshi Nakamoto. I mean, if anybody's going to pick
his very first key, the one that we know is actually from him or whatever, the one that's been used to sign things previously was just 2048-bit or 1024-bit. Okay. But that was because that's what we expected back then, years and years ago. I think that original key is like 2008 or something.
On this topic, we have also updates on new clues that suggest that Craig Wright, the suspected Bitcoin creator, may have just been a hoaxer, which is kind of
right. So this is actually coming from Wired, who wrote the original article.
Yeah, this was starting to percolate last week when we were talking about this a little bit.
Yeah, so like Wired points out that they said this could all be a hoax in their article, but they talk about some of it and some more stuff that they had gotten and some other things that have came up. So. For example, some of the evidence they had was apparently that the Craig Wright guy owns two of the machines in the top 500 supercomputer list. And when they talked to him, one of them was apparently made by SGI, and SGI says, well, we never sold him one. I guess you could have bought it secondhand or something, so that's not necessarily definitive. But when they talk to the top 500 organizers that make the list, they wouldn't say how they verify that someone actually has the machine they claim to get on the list.
I never thought about that.
Then if he claims to have a PhD.
2 PhDs, yeah on his since deleted LinkedIn.
The PhD was in, what's it say there?
One was from Charles Sturt University in Bathurst, Australia, in computer science. And now they tell
PhD
Forbes.
Computer science. And when the university asked, well, we never gave him a PhD, but he does have 3 master's degrees in network and system administration, IT management, and information system security. So it's not like he doesn't have any credentials, but maybe not the one he claimed. Which is interesting. And then some of the PGP evidence that Motherboard found. Yeah. But they also talk about some other stuff they have, where especially the person that gave them the articles, or at least the hacker that was after Gizmodo, made some accusations that Wired didn't have enough evidence, and so they didn't print because they were quite bad, apparently. And so they're pretty sure that isn't something that Craig Wright would have wrote about himself. Right?
Okay.
And then there's some talk about, some of the stuff was, the backdated blog posts, but that was done in like 2013. So somebody's been working on this hoax for 2 years. Does that make sense? And
well, maybe.
There's some talk about that this could actually be somebody trying to blackmail Craig to get some of the Bitcoins or something. And
that's been a Reddit theory going around.
Yeah. So there's definitely a lot going on here. But Motherboard and Wired have published more of what they have.
Oh, there you go.
But it seems like if you're the guy that has all the original documents and give them to Wired, and they don't seem to be chasing the story you want, the way you want it, then you just go find someone who will, or just publicly post the documents. So.
Nice follow-up. Thank you, Alan. What about Google's proactive measures? Now, that sounds like something you need to do so you don't get the flu. What's going on?
So when I first saw this, I was remembering back a couple weeks where Google's like, so Smandac, you issued fake certificates for Google. That's not allowed. How about you double check and Semantic's like, oh yeah, we checked. There was only like 9. It's not a big deal. And Google's like, well, we found 168 more. So,
Yeah.
what the hell?
Yeah.
And then, they did an audit more. Oh, we found like 2,000. Anyway, it went on. But Google's like, so we want to see, an audit report and post-mortem telling us how this happened and how you didn't catch it the first time and why it took you 3 audits to find some of the certificates we found and so on. Or we're going to revoke your trust. And also, we're going to require that certificate transparency where you tell us about every certificate you issue by June of next year, or we won't trust you at all. So I thought it was related to that, but it turns out it's not. This is just something else that's happening in the meantime.
Okay.
The semantic things with Google is still happening, but that deadline's not till June. So Google will now actively distrust Symantec's Class 3 Public Primary Certificate Authority. This root CA certificate was issued back in 1996, although it doesn't expire until 2028 because, in 1996 we thought that was fine. It's being retired because it uses the SHA-1 hashing algorithm, and the CA/browser forum dictates that after December of this year, you need to be using SHA-512, right? So normally this wouldn't be a big deal. They would cite a certificate or whatever. However, because this certificate's been in use since 1996 when it was owned by VeriSign, it's used for code signing and all this other stuff too.
I bet.
And so they don't want to just kill off certificate entirely. So Symantec's like, we're not going to use this for, SSL certificates anymore, but we're not going to kill it off completely. And we'll use it for other things. And Google's like, well, that doesn't mean it's going to stop you from issuing google.com certificates with it. So basically, Google will blacklist the certificate and not trust it, even though it'll still be valid and say your OS 10 certificate store so that apps signed will still be, considered valid or whatever.
Okay.
Although it kind of raises the question, it's like, well, if we consider SHA-1 too weak because someone could find a hash collision and make a fake certificate that would let them sign some code, maybe we want to stop using it altogether. Anyway, Google's post on it also has a link to Symantec's post on it and all the details. It'll be interesting to see if Firefox also pulls this certificate or what happens. Interesting is the Symantec seems to be pretty cavalier about killing off the certificate. They're like, we don't expect this to affect anybody. It's like, they're like, if you have one of these certificates, you can just go under your management panel and reissue it. It's like, sure, but how many people are going to do that?
Yeah.
Or are going to do
all
that
just
before,
following the news and yeah.
Yeah. Or are going to do that before they start getting a bunch of users complaining that the certificate's not trusted anymore. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that.
So let's talk about another vendor who makes their money off of people who think they need to secure their computer from boogeymen. MacKeeper has a little bit of egg on their face. I guess this is like some sort of like antivirus program for the Mac.
It's more of like one of those cleanup, make your computer faster programs that are usually just
the stuff that cron jobs already do, that kind of thing.
More along the lines of, oh, this is super sweeper. It makes your computer faster.
And so what happened? Their customer database was compromised?
So it turns out, they like to word it as their customer database was compromised. Turns out they have a MongoDB for their database, and it's just totally open to the public, and anybody can go in and use the data. Just completely exposed to the internet. Just pants around the ankles.
Wow. So not a compromise at all. A complete and total malpractice of configuration.
And on top of it all, the passwords in it are hashed with plain MD5 and
yes, awesome.
Instead of proper.
And I'm sure the type of users that bought that application are going to be the type of users that use different passwords for everything with password managers. And
just from the screenshot there, it looked like there are like 13 million unique users, but like 1 million of them were paying for a subscription at one point.
Wow.
So I don't know if there's any payment details in there as well. It's hard to say.
So what was that like? So it was like a 21 gigabyte database, something like that?
Yeah.
Jeez. Well, I guess it could be worse. It could be a 650 terabyte database. What is this?
Well, so digging back, so a researcher had looked at how bad the Mongo databases that were exposed to the internet were, because it's Mongo database the default configuration's a bit iffy. It's meant to be run on a LAN, not on a public IP address. And so it just doesn't have security on by default.
Good.
So the guy that, after that MacKeeper story came out, the guy who'd done some original research said, yeah, so I've gone through Shodan, the search engine for version strings or whatever, and compiled a list of all the MongoDBs I could get access to on the entire internet. And it turns out it adds up to 650 terabytes of Mongo databases that I can poke over the internet.
Ooh, wow. I see. So that's a bit of
So yeah, it's 35,000 completely no authentication MongoDB instances on the internet. Database is just, legs spread wide open.
Now, everybody knows that credit card theft and stealing identities, that's child's cybersecurity, cyber hacking. The real cyber thieves are now stealing entire homes. Dun, dun, dun.
Yep. Get enough information, fake being person, and sell the house out from underneath somebody. Maybe they're still living there, whatever. You sell the house, get all the money and run.
Yeah.
And then, the person who's living in the house is like, what the hell, when somebody shows up trying to move in.
Yeah.
It's like, I bought this house. It's like, not from me, you didn't.
I'm surprised this isn't more of a thing, actually.
Well, it's becoming more of a thing. There's stories in the US and UK of this happening. And so,
you know what?
The other one I remember reminds me of, I didn't think of it for the retrospective episode, but remember that story from Australia where they hijacked his cell phone to get the two-factor auth stuff to steal all the money from his mortgage account? He had one of those, like, I forget what you kind of call the account, but basically it's
Authy,
line of credit.
Oh, yeah.
So instead of having a regular mortgage where you pay it every month, you have this super checking account where it's like for the entire value of your mortgage, and you just pay it off as you can or whatever. Anyway.
Now, this next roundup stories feels like maybe it's a good companion to episode 170 of Unfilter, Why Governments Lie About Encryption Backdoors.
Yeah. So this one is like, we're all sitting here wondering, how stupid are the people in government that they don't realize that putting backdoors in encryption is a stupid idea? Well, this article postulates that they know that, but they just don't care because, they want access to all the data.
That would seem to be the case.
They also are smart enough to realize that this is not going to help them catch any of the really bad terrorists. Not the really bad terrorists, only the really bad terrorists.
Right. I follow you.
Not the terrorists that are evil, the terrorists that are bad at being terrorists.
The terrorists that are dumb.
Yeah.
This is the page that crashed my flash. Our next story, Alan, the VTech hack. We have a 21-year-old man arrested from the data breach, and it was their little autoplay.
This happened just recently, and the BBC and the International Business Times have coverage on a 21-year-old man that was arrested in the UK in relation to that attack.
That story was awful. That was just awful. All right, so tell me about this, because I started seeing this covered today, and this seems like this might be a big story for the Linux Action Show, so I'd love to kind of get your take on it right now. A Grub2 authentication problem that could be out in the wild right now, or is out in the wild right now, isn't it?
Right. So in Grub, you can configure basically a username and password thing so that people can't start your computer that aren't you or whatever. And I think it can also be hooked up to disk encryption. I'm not sure. I don't use Grub. But turns out if you, at the username prompt, hit backspace 28 times, it will just let you in.
I'm sorry. You're okay. So you mean after I inject code into the bootloader environment?
No. You just walk up to the machine at the username prompt and press backspace 28 times, and then boom, you're in.
And that's all it takes.
Yep. So it's basically integer underflow. So normally you go and you type in the password or the username, right? And it counts how many characters you've done. Every time you press a letter, it increases the counter by 1. And when you hit backspace, it decreases it by 1. And it uses that to know how long the username you typed is. And then it zeroes out some memory for everything, that basically the username can be up to 1,000 characters long, or 1024. So it takes how much you've typed and 1 for the null, and then zeroes out everything after that. And it turns out that if you give it a big negative value, you can go and erase some other bit of memory, and then, everything just works.
This is why they're calling it back to 28. That's clever.
Yes.
Okay, I love it.
But they have some great breakdown on how it actually works, and you can basically see it all there. and it's been there since at least December 2009.
Heyo, gotta love it.
But they have proof of concept code there, and
So there could be a couple
basically
machines
show
that have this. So
and they also show a patch for fixing it, which is quite trivial. It's just adding checks to the two places where we decrease the counter by 1 to make sure that the counter isn't already 0, because you don't want it to ever be a negative number, because the type of integer they use to store it doesn't allow negative, so it overflows to being 4 billion.
this is why systemd needs to replace grub. Just need system.
This is why I wrote my own bootloader, and it's currently being reviewed and will be committed to FreeBSD soon.
Beautiful, beautiful. Wow, that's gorgeous. All right, let's talk about this Excel flaw, because everybody loves a good Excel 0 day. Is this really a 0 day? What's this?
Yes. So this is a 0 day in Microsoft Excel, having to do binary worksheets, and use after free could allow remote code execution. So they go on to talk about the vulnerability, and they have a timeline here with Microsoft where, the 0 day initiative, which is this open source thing run by Hewlett Packard that lets people work on exploits like this. And back on September 8th, they disclosed this to Microsoft. And turns out that, so they went back and forth with Microsoft, and Microsoft did an initial fix for part of it. But then in the follow-up, they were just like...
Yeah, so it looks like the vendor... So after they published, Microsoft is reevaluating their stance, but since September 8th, they've just been getting sort of punted around. Oh, yeah, we're looking into it. We're looking into it.
They originally disclosed the vulnerability to Microsoft, and Microsoft acknowledged it and gave it a case number the next day. And then they sent a question about, what pop-ups did the user get during this? So then they replied that the user had no attempt to recover their data. And the vendor replied that this bug is headed towards closure, and that the same issue as some other number that had been reported but is not public yet, so it's just X'd out. And then 0 day initiative notified the vendor that the case still causes a problem. And the vendor replied that they'll look at it. And then the vendor replied that we take a defense in depth approach to solving this issue and made code improvements that we believe would also mitigate this case. While this case still crashes, it does so only after the user has accepted the risk that it could cause a crash. As such, we will resolve this issue as won't fix. And so then after the 120 days that CDI gives vendors, they published this on the 14th. And since then, on the 17th, Microsoft is now reevaluating their stance and will work on a fix for this. And this is why a lot of people advocate for a time limit on disclosures like this, or just going public right away. I like the 90 to 120 days, seems reasonable, because otherwise, if this had never become public, Microsoft probably would never have fixed it.
Right.
But because after 120 days, we drew the line and pushed this through, now Microsoft, we created enough uproar that Microsoft might actually fix the problem.
It would appear so. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Good one. All right, let's talk about OPSEC for honeypots. And I'm thinking about this. This is kind of an important thing. These are pretty interesting devices that if you don't configure right, would be pretty obvious are a honeypot to a sophisticated attacker.
Right. So the point of a honeypot is to catch the attacker and, more importantly, see what they're actually trying to do so you can make sure you can guard the rest of your machines against it. It's no good if they can trivially tell that it's a honeypot and just skip it. So basically, they did some showdown searches and were able to basically find a bunch of the honeypots and write filters so that they could just do a search and find everything that's not a honeypot. And so they walked through some of the examples of how the honeypots give themselves away. In the one, they like all the honeypots that are pretending to be these PLCs, the programmable logic controllers, the like SCADA
industrial
systems,
yeah.
all had the same serial number. Well, if you see 104 devices with the same serial number, they're probably honeypots, not real devices, right? Or another one, they had the name, and it was like PLC name, PG, and then raw code that's supposed to generate a random number but wasn't being executed. So instead of a random number, it's random integer between 0 and 1 or whatever. And it's like, well, that makes it pretty obvious that this is a script pretending to be one of these things and not the actual thing. And a bunch of that nature. And then some of them were just like, the honey trap fake vulnerable FTPD. It's like, well, that kind of gives it away a little bit, doesn't it? Or in the other one, this one has is multiple version strings. So it's like it claims to be free FTPD and war FTPD at the same time. So that, when you're doing a scan and you just search for a version number or whatever, it's going to ping yours no matter which one they're searching for. But it makes it pretty obvious that it's not either of those. It's a honey trap. And a bunch of things like that.
So this is sort of like things they noticed when they looked into it, so things to watch out for. So if you're going to implement something like this,
don't make these dumb mistakes that other people have.
We'll have a link of that for that in the roundup.
Think about it a little bit. The best way to do it is think like the attacker. And, if it's very easy for you to go through there and figure out which ones are fake and just not hit them, then those honeypots have failed to do what they're supposed to do, which is catch people trying to mess with your SCADA system so you can figure out what you have to do to harden your SCADA system.
Does it feel like we have a Joomla vulnerability almost every other week on this show now? I mean, like, what's going on?
It turns out that when you make a bunch of hype about a vulnerability in an application, people go and look for other ones and find them.
So we got a critical 0 day remote command execution vulnerability in Joomla.
So this one's really bad. So it turns out if you your browser sends a user agent string, right, which tells a website what browser you're using.
Sure, yeah.
And some websites use this to tell when you're on a phone to give you a different version of the website or whatever.
Yep.
They can often have your screen resolution in them so that the website can adapt itself.
This website only works on Internet Explorer.
Yeah. Well, it turns out when Joomla is processing that to try to do stuff, if you inject some an object, a PHP object or whatever, into your user agent string, it'll just like execute that or run it into the database or whatever.
Are you saying I could hack a Joomla site by changing my user agent string?
Yes. So if you tell your browser to pretend to be...
No, hold on. This has got to be the worst I've ever heard. So I don't even... I just changed my user agent. I could do that with any extension for any browser.
Yeah, you just go into like about::config in Firefox and find the box and type in an SQL statement or something and you win. But yeah, this one you could just inject commands into Joomla and make them run them. And
love it.
Terrible. Luckily, they have patches for this now, including patches for old unsupported version, because it turns out a lot of people run old unsupported versions of Joomla, and they really shouldn't. But luckily, they got patches anyway. Otherwise, the internet would be terrible.
Now, while we're talking about remotely injecting stuff, how about this next one in the roundup? SMTP injection via recipient email's address.
Yes. So it turns out email, something we still haven't managed to get right.
I'm giving up, Alan. I'm giving up.
So this one's basically by injecting a bunch of crap into the recipient field, the person you're sending the email to, a lot of applications can end up sending spam. So if you have a web form on your website where you let people put in their email address and you send them something based on it, like a sign-up form, and you send their confirmation email to them based on that, they could fill out the form in such a way that instead of sending that email, it would send spam to some third person. So you can see here's a picture of what a regular SMTP transaction looks like. And if you scroll down a little bit, you can see where if on the from the to line, a little bit more, you put something else, you can make all that happen all at once and send some different message. So basically, if you include the person that's going to the keyword data and then an entire message and the keyword quit in the email address, you can send an entire email to some third person using somebody else's website. And then it gets into even more complicated versions of this because it turns out we allow silly things in the name part of the email address, the vanity part that's not even the email address, to allow line breaks and stuff in there for people with long names or whatever, and a bunch of crazy stuff. And it turns out we made it way too complicated.
Great.
And they show examples of like, there's this regular expression that's like 8 lines full width long. It's like longer than your strongest password, this regular expression to check if your email address is valid, which I'm sure gets even more complicated every time we add, .Black Friday as a top level domain. But even that one you can construct one of these that will match that. It's a perfectly legitimate email address. It just causes your email server to send spam instead.
So we are often finding there's all kinds of different like trends. And one that we talked about last week was people taking over Steam accounts and then like emptying out their inventories. So we have a follow-up story.
Trading away all the stuff or scamming people into trading you stuff and all these.
This kind of reminds me of that. There's malware targeting Steam traders, which banks on the new escrow system.
Yeah, so because the amount of scamming and I'm going to guess your password, log in, and trade all your stuff away, Steam has added this escrow system where basically unless you're like two-factor authenticated, Steam will like put a hold on the trade. So you lose the item and Steam keeps it for like a day or two so that you can claim that, hey, I didn't do that. My account was hacked or whatever, and get your thing back before it's given away. And obviously the bad guys figured this out. So instead of being like, oh, damn, Steam stopped us from scamming people, they just adapted the scam to look like the new escrow system. So they made a website that looks like the dialogue in Steam when you're doing a trade. And when you click the final button, it prompts you to download escrow.exe, which, so I've heard of that. That's the new Steam escrow system, right? And run it, and now you have malware.
Brilliant. Yeah, they even gave the exe a Steam icon, too. Look. Yep. Oh, actually, when you go to details, too, does it say Valve in there?
You can write whatever you want in all of that. Only if you have the ones where you're actually checking the publish by and looking for a code sign certificate, do you actually get validation.
Interesting. It does say the original file name was 89.exe.
Huh. Somebody didn't strip out their metadata.
Yeah. So there you go. When what the good hacker always says, when you close the door, they often find a Windows. All right, Alan, and our last link in the roundup this week is a tweet. How not to implement two-factor authentication. And
so somebody was just browsing around on the internet and found this IP address that's basically somebody's webcam.
That's a webcam shooting an
RSA.
An
IP camera that's pointed at one of those RSA secure ID tokens.
So you could just check your webcam to get your token ID.
So when it's like I can't be bothered to carry this thing around with me all the time, or two people need access to this, and we can't set up two accounts because they cost extra or whatever.
Right.
There's a webcam pointed at this secure ID token, and it gives you the number every couple of seconds.
Brilliant.
So if I'm the attacker, I go and I still use the name and password. I'm like, oh, I'm stymied by not having the secure ID that changes every 10 seconds. Oh, it turns out if I just look at the webcam, there it is. Typey.
Hopefully the delay isn't too significant.
It wouldn't be that bad.
All right, that brings us to the end of the roundup, which brings us to the end of this week's episode. Now, TechSNAP won't be live for the next couple of weeks because of the holidays, but we'll be live after that. We'll still have episodes released, so be sure you are still subscribed to the feed or check the website. If you got any driving to do or
good stuff,
anything like that, should be a couple of good episodes. Yeah, and Alan made sure we have new stuff in each episode. So that's going to be pretty cool, too. Normally, though, we do the show at 1 p.m. Pacific, which is, again,
4 p.m. Eastern, 2100 UTC.
Yeah, and JupiterBroadcasting.com/calendar is where we convert it to your local time. JupiterBroadcasting.com/contact is where you go to email. And any other shenanigans, I guess also, go check out the BSC Now show and Unfiltered 170. Those are a couple of episodes this week that are related to some of the content we covered here this week. All right, everybody, thanks so much for tuning in this week's episode of TechSNAP. Have a great holiday, and we'll see you right back here next week.